Since I've painted these roses before, I want to take a different approach today. Because the background colors are so closely related to the colors and values in the foreground, especially with the roses themselves, they confuse themselves with the roses. And I don't want that. I want to separate those more. I think I'll play with that a bit. So what will work well with salmon colored roses? I was thinking about maybe a light turquoise type blue, a really grayed down version of a turquoise, not something like you'd see on somebody's bracelet. And it looks like I'm going to need to get some more transparent oxide yellow out on my palette. I use a lot of that color. So when I talk about a grayed down version of turquoise, I'm talking about the idea of maybe phthalo green, or what a lot of artists use, the viridian green mixed with my transparent oxide colors, like the transparent oxide yellow or oxide orange or oxide red, also called earth colors. Mixing with those earth colors, that has just enough yellow in it and some red in some of those to really tone down the greens, especially since red and green are opposites. They tend to gray one another down. So mixing that with white, I get a really nice, what looks like plants off in the distance in my background. And I like that idea. Now, what I want to avoid, and the reason I did my original painting in dark tones, was to avoid that confusion. It was in an attempt to separate the greens in the leaves of the roses and the colors in those flowers from all the leaves and colors in the background. So I'm taking a chance here with the colors that I'm using in the background now, but I really like the idea of those blues, and especially those grayed down blues, working with all of those yellow and orange and salmon colors in the roses, because I think that they're going to complement one another really well and be a really good fit for each other. I think that background is going to have the essence, or will simulate well, a really brightly lit landscape with lots of different plants and leaves and branches and stems all there in the background, but kind of like almost a blurred out photograph, the way you'd have the background blurred out in a photograph and the foreground coming into focus more. That's a little bit of the idea, but with a lot more texture and brush strokes and all of that showing in that background. I want it to have a lot of visual interest, but still fade off and gray out into the distance so that it doesn't compete. And that's my goal with all of that. I want to get rid of most of that, leaving just a hush of lighter color to simulate a really bright, well-lit landscape. The sound is going to be a little different because I switch up mics a couple of times throughout the video, but it's generally in long stretches, so it shouldn't be distracting for you. And I hope you enjoy all of the instruction here today. So most of the preliminary background work that I'm doing right now is preparing for the roses to come on top. And I'm a real fan of wild plants, wild growth in gardens and the outdoors. I just love the variety that we get when it's not all cultured. There are weeds growing in there, clumps of grass mixed in with plants, and sometimes it's just the bush itself. Like in this instance, I've decided that I'm going to use kind of a semblance of the photo that we started with our group, our paint together, but because there's such a close-knit values pattern and color temperature harmony between the roses, the leaves and stems of the roses, and all of the plants in the background, I want to do something different from that. So I did that previous darker background rose painting of this particular reference photo. So now I'm going to go in a completely different direction with the lighter background, which I haven't done in a long time. And I wanted to really play with the color harmony of the blue turquoise colored, the real light gray kind of blues, and the salmon and peach colors of those roses, because I love that combination, that color combination. So to start with, I want to get a real vigorous, wild kind of look to the background colors that I put in there, the background spaces and shapes, and get a lot of vigorous activity and motion in there before I start to put the roses on top, because that gives me then a lot more energy in the very beginning to help me when I put the roses in there. I don't have to necessarily add all of that in after I've got the roses established. I can come back in afterwards and wipe out an area where I want to have the rose if I want to get back down to that white, which often I do, because then I can get more of that glow, that translucent glow that comes from the white of the panel and the light coming and bouncing off that white panel and back through the paint. Especially when I'm using thinner, transparent layers of paint, you get that white, that light bouncing off of there, and it just creates a more translucent feeling in the flowers. So to get that, I can wipe off part of that background and get down to that white and then start to add my flowers in. But that's easy. That's very easy to do, to just go in, wipe it off, and when I'm wiping it off, I'm also drawing my roses. So I'll take a paper towel, I'll shape the paper towel so that I can use it like a drawing utensil, and just wipe off and get the overall shapes that I want in those roses. So when I approach a painting like this, I have an overall idea of what it is that I want to accomplish, the feeling especially of what I want to achieve, but I don't have every step of the way planned out. I just have the general sense of what I'm hoping for, and then I can build on top of that. And I let a lot of the, like with putting in the vigorous background, I let a lot of the happy accidents that might occur, those combinations that are fun, that come about from being a little bit loose and wild with the establishment of all that, just have its day. And then I can put the roses on top of that and then get that same feeling, a little bit of that wild looseness, into my roses as well. So they all feel like they belong together. And then the roses feel like they're in an environment that is really conducive to flowers, to roses, to the look that I want. It feels like there's a whole environment out there with plants behind and plants in front of maybe, but just a lot of plant activity going on in this whole arena. That's a lot of the stuff that I think about in the very beginning before I ever start to put paint down on my panel. And there are some people that really love the cultured look. I went out to a home where one of my students was good friends with a lady who grows a lot of peonies. And I asked if I could come out and paint some of those peonies and get a lot of reference photos from them. So I went out there, and when I was talking to the owner, it's a very nice home, very expensive home, lots of flowers everywhere. They have a big lake behind the house. So it was really a beautiful setting. And in talking to her, we came to the consensus that she likes the very cultured, cultivated look in her peonies with her bushes. She doesn't want to have any weeds around. She wants just the peony bushes and plenty of mulch around those, and then the nice edging that goes in front of all of those bushes, and rock or concrete sidewalks all around, that sort of look. And I would prefer to have some tufts of grass growing up through some of those leaves, and maybe some weeds here and there, just to give it more variety and interest and make it more fun, I think, for the viewer to look at, rather than this real French garden feeling to it. Now, French gardens can be fun to paint. I have done that before, and some of those that are in Switzerland or in some of the European countries where it's that old world feel. You've got the old stone walls and lots of very pristinely landscaped plants everywhere, trees and flowers. That's a lot of fun too. But there's something to the great outdoors and the wildness of nature that is very intriguing for me, and it gives me a lot of material to add in there on a whim, just to improve my composition or to make the whole feeling of the painting a little more vigorous and exciting and energetic. Sometimes it just takes me a while to figure out exactly where I want to place the brush stroke. So I will often draw in the air. I'm getting my location down exactly where I want to put it. And occasionally that takes me a moment or two of going up to it, looking at it, making sure that that's where I feel like it needs to be. And then I might come back to deliberate for a moment and then go back and finally place the stroke down. But I'd rather be very confident about where I'm placing my strokes than to be quick about it, especially when it comes to a painting like this where I've already established a lot of the background. I don't necessarily want to come in and do a lot of changes if I can help it, like what I'm doing right now. So I decided that I didn't like the placement of that rose. Actually, of both of the roses. Just they're a little bit too far over. It puts the rose on the right too close to the center, and I wanted to set them off center more than that. So I decided to just wipe them off and start over again. Sorry that you had to watch the whole beginning of that and then have it all be gone in one fell swoop, but that's kind of the nature of painting. If at first we don't succeed, we've got to wipe it off and start over again. So I put in a couple of more strokes, just kind of drew around on it, testing things out, and then decided I would wait on it for the Facebook Live session that I was doing that night. I decided to try out, I have these rosemary ivory long flats, and they don't work.
There.
Oh, they're up there. They don't work out real well for me when I'm doing my vigorous landscape, like when I'm putting in foliage or anything that I'm brushing back and forth, because I have a tendency to push my brush forward. But when I'm doing and what happens is it splays out the bristles. But when I'm doing something like rose petals, where it's a lot softer, I'm usually going in a certain direction. And especially with a rose petal, I really want to control the stroke so that I get a particular shape with a petal. And rather than coming in and drawing all of it in, I will put it down in one motion oftentimes. So the rosemary ends up working out, the ivories work out well for that. So what happened was I started with the rose that I'm going to put in the background. I had it over here just earlier today, and I decided I didn't want that right here, so I'm moving it over. I had a nice rose going and then decided that wasn't the right spot. So that's the nature of playing with some of the shapes in our paintings. So when I start putting in my petals, I'm much more careful. When I'm putting in the background, I'm kind of moving around, flying at will with it, just creating some, what I consider fun and interesting movement in the background. When I start doing roses, I like to get a lot of the petals all in one movement, so I try to be a little more careful sometimes with my drawing. When I start getting some of that in there. And I must say, I just got, at the last OPA show in Cincinnati, I got some of Michael Harding's paints because I've heard so much about them. And I bought just the quinacridone red and ultramarine blue, and they really are good paints. I didn't expect them to be quite that impressive, but they are. I've been using Gamblin and Utrecht for 30 years, and I've used a lot of different paints, Rembrandt and Winsor Newton, all kinds of stuff. But these Michael Harding, he does do a good job with his paints. So it means I'm going to be forced to probably buy some of them and try out even more colors. So with the petals here, I'm using a mix of quinacridone red and cad yellow medium because I want these roses to be a very orange, reddish orange color and have a lot of the peach tones and some of the more highlighted spots on it. And I think I just went back right into my spot that I wiped off, not paying nearly enough attention because I was talking too much, and put it right back where I wiped it off. So
maybe it's just meant to be
that was
there.
brilliant. No, I don't think so, because this other one's going to get crowded right off the side. And I decided I wanted to have them a little bit smaller too. Okay, so I could do 3 roses, a small here. Nah, I think that'll get crowded. Could break him up with some leaves, but then that kind of puts that one right almost in the center. I like to have a space on either side that is unequal. And right now I've got the same kind of spacing going on here. This one might disrupt it if I put in 3 roses, but it still seems to be too much. So I think I'm just gonna wipe it off and go after it again. Or, you know what, actually maybe I'll let that kind of fade back into the background as if there's a third one back in there. How about that? I'll try that and see if that works. So I can lighten up here in a bit. That's what I'll do. So we'll come back in with the, so what I've got going on here is this one's going to be turned away from us and in the shadow. And then I'll sometimes, even if it's not in the photograph, I might pull a little bit of a petal off somewhere just to make it more fun and interesting looking. So, in the spirit of pushing that back, or with that idea in mind, maybe I'll bring in a leaf right now. Play with it. So when it comes to putting in the leaves now, when I'm dealing with a light background like that, I need to make sure that I actually know where I'm putting that leaf, because I don't want to continually wipe it off and start over again, because then I have to come back in, try to get the same feeling from with the background and all of that. So let's see. So I could come in with something like that and come over the top of that and start to push one of those back in the background. And if I really don't like what's happening here in the end, I can come back in with some leaves and cover that over too. So with a brush like this, oh sorry, wrong end. With a brush like this, it's an extra long flat, or sorry, an extra long filbert, and I love this for its fluidity. I can hold it back on the handle and just kind of let it have its own mind, its own motion. So even a little mark like that, often what I'm doing is I'm coming in and just breaking up the spaces. Okay, so with roses, I realize that there is a way that rose leaves, they come in and usually in fives. You have one leaf that's out in front, two on the sides, two on the sides here. So it's usually in a pattern, maybe 3 leaves or 5 leaves, that kind of a pattern. But that doesn't mean we have to paint them that way, because when they're in nature, I have a lot of rose bushes, and the leaves will get twisted in amongst each other and turned. So we can come in with an individual rose leaf and put it somewhere that we want to have it. This whole idea of it doesn't work that way, we're not botanists, we're artists. Is that right? Botanist? Is that okay? That suddenly didn't sound right. We're here to create something magical for the viewer, not to record what we saw in nature. Some people want to do that, and that's perfectly fine as well, but that's not what I do. I just made those into, they will change though. I'm not going to have wings there, they'll be alright. Okay, let's see. And sometimes at the beginning of a painting, I will just play with some things to see where I want to go with it. So maybe I'll pull this across, and that way it's not just coming straight down. I could have it as like a rambler or a climbing rose or something where the branches are going sideways off of there, and then I can get a little bit more variety in it than just coming right off the bottom. So I don't always think through exactly what I'm going to do in the beginning of a painting. Sometimes I change it up. So at a point like this, especially when I have a light background and I'm trying to avoid having to erase anything that I've done or paint over it with real thick paint, which is easily a possibility, but if I'm trying to avoid that at all, what I'm looking for are interesting shapes, making sure that the roses aren't just pretty to look at, but that they're each shape within the overall shape of the rose, each petal as a shape is interesting in itself, and that something like a branch or a stem will also have movement and something interesting about it for the viewer. So that's some of the stuff I'm looking for right now. So maybe I'll get some dark in here. So when I'm moving my brush back and forth but nothing's getting put on the panel, it's because that's how I draw. That's how I take and kind of figure it out in my mind where I might want to have something before I actually commit myself to it. I don't want to put it on there until I kind of know the motion. So you can see I'm not just like thinking how am I going to draw this specific shape. I'm thinking about how I'm going to put a specific motion and movement into my painting, how I'm going to move the viewer through it. Alright, so let's get a little bit more of the roses themselves.
When you take your photos for reference, do you look for the same characteristics? And it looks like Spike was going to continue with that because he says, or do you?
Same characteristics of...
I'm assuming the same characteristics of what you described in your what your shapes and stuff.
Yeah, so if I'm...
is what he was going to continue
Yeah,
with.
okay.
It might be something different. If so, Spike, continue and I'll ask when you get done.
So when it comes to my reference photos, sometimes I'm just out there and I'll just take hundreds of photos, just boom boom, snapping shots like crazy, because now that we have digital, it's all free. I don't have to worry about taking a roll of 24 photos in to get it processed. So there are times when I'll just start snapping away, trying to hope that something will come out well. But often, when I'm out in nature, I am looking for something specific. So I will photograph that way. I will take a photograph and compose it as much as I can.
And it must be an artist eye because he stops at the places where the ugliest things are. And he'll sit there and snap 100 pictures. Then he'll make a masterpiece out of it, so I can't say anything about it, but...
Yeah.
And then I'll see something I think is quite spectacular, and he might snap a selfie of us in front of it for Facebook, so... somebody's asking if you're using all Michael Harding paint, and are you adding any mediums?
I am not. Most of my paint on here is Gamblin and Utrecht. I've been using those forever. I also have a blue-black from RGH. They're out of New York, and they were recommended by Stapleton Kearns, so I've tried out a couple of colors by them. But for the most part, it's still Gamblin and Utrecht, because I can get I get these big 150 mil tubes, and that's what I like. I like to put usually a lot of paint on my palette all at once. Even when I'm on location, I put big gobs of paint on there so that I don't have to let that distract me out on location. We already have to work so fast, I don't want to have to stop and put more paint on my palette. 1 second. Okay, so real quick, I'll point this out. That's why I start with the middle value colors in my flowers, is because I can come back on top, and usually I don't do it with such a stiff brush, like a bristle. Oftentimes I'll use something like one of these. They're the equivalent of the mongoose hair that we used to use, but they're a long flat. And I can get some paint on one of those and just let it dance across where I want to have a petal. And that creates then I've got the shadow, and it's as if the sun is coming on top and catching that. So that gives a lot more interest to it. Okay, so back to the paints. Let's see. With the Michael Harding, I only have the two, the ultramarine blue and the quinacridone red, because I wasn't sure if there was really going to be anything to concern myself with getting more of them. But now it looks like I will be getting more of them eventually. And what was the other part of the question?
Nothing. It was just the photo stuff. But I'm just curious how you guys catalog your way too many photos, as Spike says.
Oh, no doubt. You know what? Most of the photos I end up taking, I don't even look at them. I end up just out there, mostly for the experience of being outside and taking pictures, I think, because a lot of the photos end up going by the wayside, and I don't end up looking at them because I just don't have time to go through all my photos.
So, Laura Turner Senchak, the other part of the paint question, which, sorry, I forgot. It was any medium added.
Oh, at the very beginning when I did the wash here, I did that with walnut oil. Painting is definitely one of those amazing things that it's kind of like, well, I don't play a lot of golf. I get to play maybe once or twice a year. Sometimes I'll go out with the kids a couple more times than that, but I just don't have the time for it. But it's always fun because it doesn't seem, it's not one of those sports that you can perfect. It's always challenging. It's the same thing with art. That's what makes it so much fun, is that it's a very challenging endeavor. So, I don't know if you could see that very well, but what I do with my brush when I'm trying to create a leaf like that is I started with the very tip of the, it's a flat, so this is, I like flats because of that. I can get the very corner of it. I start with the corner of it, and then I kind of move it around and reshape the brush as I go, and then pull it up again so I can get a variety of shape in there rather than just one constant shape as I move it through. And that's where these brushes, we can have a lot of fun with them. So I can put in something like this, and then later I can do the same thing that we've done with the roses. Once I have the middle ground in there, I can come in with some area that might have a highlight on it. And I like a lot all those reds that we'll see on rose stems and leaves. So I can come in and, so that would be like a Cad Red medium that I put in there. And then I might come in with a touch of Cad Red Light somewhere. Whoops, I didn't mean to take it all off. To really punch that up with some color. So then I can start to pull some of the colors that are in the flowers down into the background as well. And that's what's so wonderful about landscapes and flowers, is that we have just an amazing assortment of colors to work with. So we can kind of pull from one place to use those things in another place. Just like that, even just little subtle things as we go can bring a lot of interest into it. And then when I do that, I'm not coming in and putting in a real strong line like, okay, I've got to have it going straight, just like perfect. It's nothing in nature is perfect, so we don't have to be perfect either. You can come in and play with things, with lines. fact, it's usually better if we don't get too uptight with it. Now I'll have to change all that because that's pretty messy looking, but still we can come in and just have fun. In fact, if I just... So I can change all of that. I can start to now, with some of the leaf stuff, play as if some of this is way off in the distance, so it gets lighter and kind of fades away a bit. And this color here that I'm playing with is done with manganese blue and transparent oxide yellow and white. So I can take that same thing that I just put down and fade it away if I don't want to have all of that in here. So I still don't have to come in and necessarily redo everything or wipe it off and start over. I can just play with it. And there's nothing, you won't find a collector usually that'll complain that you have too much brush or paint texture in your painting. So covering over things with color like that is not going to hurt anything. And that didn't work out because I don't like that light color right there. I want to keep my, at least, even when I'm playing around like that, until I know what I want to do with it, I don't want to have a value in there that does not fit. And as this comes down and curves again, as if it has a plane like this, and then the plane moves down and changes the angle of that plane, then I'm going to get farther away from the light, so it's going to get even darker down in there. So I do want to watch my values a bit when it comes to something like that. And then I might take some of that same stuff and get some actual paint up in some of these areas. I like the mix of the browns and those bluish greens. So I might try that in a couple other areas in here to get it to feel like there's something happening all around us, all around the flowers. As if there's a bunch of nature going on out there or something. So I like to come in with some thick paint here and there. Usually not quite this soon into the painting, but I do love thick paint. And especially thick paint with brush texture going through it. Because then I can come back in with stems and other bits of color and move it through, and it has it kind of blending without over blending. I don't want to blend it like it's a smooth blend, but an under mixing kind of blend with it can really get interesting to look at. Oops. Okay. With leaves, nice thing about that I really love about rose leaves as well is that you can get a great mix of warm and cool colors and shadow and light, where the light's hitting on some and then you have others that are dark and off in the shadows. I think I want to change up maybe that leaf a bit. much of what I'm doing has no rhyme or reason. It's just kind of throwing things around on here until I get what I think feels fun to look at. So I'm thinking that the 3 roses probably isn't going to work out. I'll probably come back in with some of this bluish color and carve back into this and move this flower over a little bit. But I can come in like this with some of that light on the edge of that rose. Of course that won't work, but
We have some Spanish-speaking visitors today, and so if anyone is able to translate what's being said and wants to let us know.
yeah, I don't
Lo
speak
siento, no habla español. So, but we love having you here, and we have a lot of friends that are in the Spanish-speaking realm that have ordered one of Bill's videos that is translated into Spanish. So.
Yeah, the master course we did, we had translated into Spanish because there were so many followers that spoke Spanish, but otherwise I don't speak any Spanish at all, I'm afraid. And I'll probably end up having to finish this weekend, so it won't be one of those where I try to finish it out over a series of Facebook Live sessions or anything, sorry, because I need to get this. We have our monthly webinar next Saturday, or is it
Maybe.
2 Saturdays?
I don't know. I've lost track of time.
I am terrible with time. When I was doing my MFA, I actually missed some of my classes once in a while because I would get involved with painting and forget all about anything else. So as far as when the next Facebook Live is, or the next monthly webinar, I think it's
I can
coming
tell
up.
you here in a second. I have it on my calendar. So.
But I am really bad with all of that sort of thing.
Let's see.
Okay, so I'm gonna.
We have some great submissions for that too. I'm so excited for that.
Yeah, members are doing amazing work.
They are. So it is the 29th.
Oh yeah,
so,
that'll be a lot better. Okay, the 29th. Okay.
Yeah, so we have
good.
2
So
weeks.
I have 2 Saturdays. All right. But I plan on finishing this soon because I also have to get out and go. I have an on-location session that's coming up, and so I don't want to. I need to finish this thing up very quickly. Okay, so that's much nicer to have that smaller. So you can see how we don't have to worry about that's the nice thing about oil paint. I did a lot of watercolor when I was in college, but I love oil because I can come in and cut back in at will. And you have to plan out a whole lot more with watercolor. In fact, I don't think I really like that petal right there, so just come in with some thick paint. Disrupt it a little, just like that, and that's already starting to work better. So I'll come back in with this and make these a little bit smaller and more intimate than the larger flowers that I did before in my previous painting of this reference photo. And you notice I'm not worried about some of the, in fact it's a great thing, I don't worry about some of this paint that's in the background or from the rose itself getting into the background. I like that. I usually try to work at having some of that going on because it integrates the main subject, the roses, with the background. So maybe I'll try to separate these two from each other more than what they are. And I don't get attached to work I've done.
Try not.
I try not to, because there might be something like that where I suddenly need to move something over or wipe it off and redo it again because it's not working.
It's that artist passion. Can't help it.
But get attached to things?
Yes.
Ah, I see. That was terrible. That little highlight that I put on there, that was just kind of to show what is possible, but I didn't like it. So it's gone. I'm thinking I might just have some fun with a couple of areas of highlighted rose petals, and then more everything in shadow. I like that, with just a few highlighted spots like this, really bright. I'll use those to direct the viewer to that spot initially, and then lead them around with just a more subtle highlight and shadow in here. And I like the branch coming sideways instead of straight up and down for this one, because it does give me more leeway with the direction of the flowers and what I can do with them. I can end up arranging them in any direction that I want. So that's always fun. That's not going to work because I'm suddenly creating a line that's going to be a bullet right out of the painting. So I'll probably move the main branch down this direction a little bit and have some twist to it. So we'll get rid of that again and just leave that ambiguous for the moment. And that's how I play with it. That's how I compose my flowers and my paintings, is I sometimes just experiment. I put something in there, I see if it's working, and then if it's not, it's gone. Part of the fun of twigs and nature is that they move. They have a lot of change that occurs, like a branch. It's usually not just a straight line, a branch on a tree. It comes up and then there's a little bit of a knot, and then it moves in another direction, and a little bit of a knot, and moves in another direction. So we can do the same thing with all these stems and branches in here. We can put a lot of different change in direction with them, so they don't just go in one predictable pattern. I don't want predictable any more than there's going to be some predictableness in there because I'm not that brilliant, but I try to avoid predictability if I can. And part of the way that I avoid predictability is by holding the brush very loosely and letting some of the brush just dance its own little jig. I do have a nice dark shadow area under here that I can play with. For contrast. Of course, I should probably decide which direction I want the stem to go if I'm going to do that, though. Some of these little spots that I put in are just so I can kind of determine my contrast level, how far I want to push the dark and light in it. Sometimes it'll be a more low key where everything is, all the values are kind of condensed into a smaller value range. Other times I really want to push the light and the dark contrasts. And I may decide that I want to change that and move it down here this direction anyway. No, that's a very uninteresting looking shape. Or, yeah, petal. Okay, so I wanted to introduce some other little spots of color in there, but that one did not work, so I did not like that. So at a point like this, I usually stop and I look in my mirror that's behind me, try to get a different perspective on it. I can go back in my studio about 20 feet, 25 feet, and so I like to go way back and see what's happening with it and just kind of disrupt my view of it a little bit, the image I have in my mind, and see what I need to change. Wondering if I need to bring in more, like a rose that's kind of coming off the end there, just for the same color now that I'm making them smaller, so that it feels like it's in a rose. We have rose hedges along the front of our yard, and so you get all kinds of flowers in there. And I love how many different flowers we can get. So if I just even a little spot of flower. Let's see. And then I can get some flowers as if they're off in the distance, as if there's haze out here and we have some flowers that are back behind. Rather than just these two here by themselves, I can actually start to put some flowers different spots, but then I have to be careful because that might end up becoming busy. But when I get a thought like that, I at least have to try it and see what that will do. So if I get an idea like that, I will usually come in and place something like that in there just a spot of color to give me an idea of what that will do to the composition, to the overall feeling that I have in here. And then I can come in and do some overlap to see what happens if I push it back into the painting. So right now I've got this leaf that's pointing right at that, and then that becomes a focal point, which I don't want it to be a focal point. I want it to be an incidental that, oh yeah, it's a bunch of roses all growing together out there. That's too. It's not working. So really, leaves, petals, everything, it's all shapes. So instead of thinking about them as flowers, I have to think about them as shapes, and that way, if one shape isn't working next to another shape, whether it's a flower or a leaf, then I know that I need to change something about that. So if I was thinking about them as leaves, I would try to draw them like they were leaves, but right now I'm trying to draw them as if they're a specific shape of color. And will that shape of color work with another shape of color that somebody might identify as a leaf or a stem or a flower?
Olivia asked a question here. I hope the group answers this as well, but what artist inspires you the most?
Oh boy, that's a tough question because I like a lot of different artists for different reasons. Let's see, if I had to think of the one who's been the most impactful, let's see.
Like picking a favorite child.
Yeah, Carl Rungus was one of my earliest really strong influences. Just the way he was a wildlife painter, but he used so much color in his wildlife paintings. I was just mesmerized when I went out to see his work in Jackson Hole, Wyoming at the Jackson Hole Wildlife Museum. It was a very strong experience for me to see his originals. There was a room full of them, and that had a big influence on me, wanting to paint with that kind of impact. I like this shadow here, but it needs something over this way. So I have to decide how much light I might want to introduce there without getting carried away. Let's see. I've always admired the Impressionists. Richard Schmid is a huge one. I think he's been a great teacher for a lot of people. I saw his work for the first time in 1989 when I was still a student, and I loved what he was doing with paint. But when it comes down to it, John Singer Sargent, I saw a show of his in the early 90s at the Denver Art Museum. They had a big show of his landscape paintings, and those were phenomenal. I had a lot of training in college for figure, but I'm not nearly as intrigued with figure work as I am with landscape. He's a phenomenal portraitist, but his landscapes were just to see the originals. It's always fun to see things in a book, but it was much more impressive to see them in person. And so,
Olivia agrees with Schmid.
I bought Schmid's first book back in when did it come out? 98 or 99, the Alla Prima. So I have the first edition of that one, and I got to go listen to a lecture he did in 99 at the Bennington Center for the Arts, and got mine signed by him at that time. So that was fun. And that's when I learned about alizarin crimson and the problems that can come if you don't use a permanent form of alizarin crimson. What was that? Is another question?
Yeah. But keep your favorite artists coming in. That's fun. That was a really good question, Olivia. Thank you.
So I might want to bring back that dark. I kind of like that dark, but I wanted to try that first.
Gail wants to know, have you ever painted on aluminum panels?
No, I've seen others that do that, but I haven't tried them yet. There's another one that I want to try as well. When I was out at the Oil Painters of America show, William Whitaker was doing a demonstration, and he uses, I think it's ABS plastic. Oh, crumb. I have it written down somewhere. And I looked it up. You basically have to get it from a plastic company. And I asked him about the strength and longevity of it. This plastic, he said, it's white all the way through, very strong. You can drop it off of a stairwell and not hardly have it damaged, he said. Much stronger than wood. He can cut it easily, and he doesn't have to prime it. He said that plastic, especially that plastic, it might look like it's like glass and it's solid through, but it's not, it's porous. So it forms a very nice mechanical bond to the oil paint, so you don't have to worry about priming it. And that's a very intriguing concept, the idea of not having to prime the panels. A lot of those things, it's really hard to tell what the long-term effects are going to be from it. William Whitaker, whose paintings sell for tens of thousands of dollars, has been using the plastic for 25 years without any negative effects from it. So I might give that a try sometime. Have you used the aluminum? Do you like working on that? Seems like there's always more materials than there's time to try them out.
I guess the experiments can be gifts for family, and then you can see what happens. All plastic will eventually turn to Jell-O. The integrity is not good for long term.
Aha. So are we talking like
Eventually
hundreds
fail.
of years, or are we talking in our lifetime?
Plastic bag in our tree up at the top that I can't reach that seems to be surviving rather well. She hasn't tried it, but it shows it is archival from her research.
You know, that term archival, it has some weaknesses to it, because there's really nothing that's truly archival in the sense that it's going to last forever. So a lot of things we really don't have to get too uptight about. So like with the aluminum, it probably is going to last longer than we need to worry about it. Plastic will probably last longer than is a concern for most of us. But even like, let's say we go to traditional. In the 90s, I used to use the oil primer and lead primer, and I would take and prime my own canvases with I would size them first with rabbit skin glue, and then realize that rabbit skin glue isn't really that archival. If it gets wet, it's not waterproof. It's gone. So
She said aluminum shows long-term 200 years plus.
wow, 200 years? That's probably long enough.
If you're not bored with it by then.
If somebody tries to bring it back, get their money back after 200 years, I don't know that we have to worry about it too much, do we? I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that goes into for history's sake and posterity and all that, but I'm more wanting to create things for the sake of painting. And if I have to worry too much about all that stuff, then it takes a little bit of the fun out of it all. So I try to use as the best materials I know how to use at the moment. But that's the science behind all this is changing all the time. I actually stopped using the oil primer back in the 90s because I read an article by a museum conservationist, a conservator who goes in and restores and has tons of experience, and he said that acrylic gesso was longer lasting and more archival and better to use for oil painting than was the rabbit skin glue oil primer method. So I thought, well, that's great for me. I didn't like having to wear a gas mask when I would prime my canvases, so I jumped ship pretty quickly and started using acrylic gesso, and I used that for a long, long time. I still do to an extent. A lot of my panels are still done with that, but I have been experimenting with other things lately.
Do you glue your canvas to your boards? And if you do, what kind of glue do you use?
Nope, this is an MDF panel, medium density fiberboard. It's actually not medium density, but that's what they call it. That's too much. Let me take that off first. Too much. I don't know, I'll have to change that up again. So this is medium density fiberboard. You want to make sure if you buy that, that you seal it all the way around, front, back, sides, because if it gets any moisture on it, it's toast. It does not work well with moisture. But once you seal it, it's a really stable, nice board to work with. So I now have my latest primer that I'm working with is the Ecos Passivating Primer. It will actually seal the board, and any formaldehyde or anything else that might be in there is sealed off. It won't leach out into the atmosphere, it won't leach into my studio. So it's very nice that way. And that's a completely green primer, has no VOCs, no harmful anything to it, which is really nice. That's one of my goals with my art. And then what was they going with the rest? Let's see. So then, canvas. I have a roll of linen lead primed canvas that I haven't used in several years. I bought it just because, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago because everyone uses it so readily. But I didn't like it as much. I like working on the panel straight off. So I just use panels now.
Olivia is saying that now they are saying that using linseed oil as medium is not archival.
They also, okay, so, you know, the whole thing about materials is, let's say Dan Gerhardt and Richard Schmid, two of the best artists in the country, and they both love the Lafranc zinc white. And from the research I've done, zinc white is actually brittle within just a very short time, 2 to 7 years it becomes brittle. It tends to crack, it tends to delaminate, even from oil grounds, and yet they rave about the Lafranc white that has zinc in it. And a lot of white today is made with zinc. So they've been painting, Richard Schmid's been using that for decades, and except for the problem he had with the traditional alizarin crimson. He did a painting once where he did it with a lot of reds on a dress on his wife Nancy, and it was a large painting. I remember seeing it in Southwest Art. It sold for $150,000 at the time. This is back, yeah, a long time ago. And at that lecture that I was at in Vermont, he said that the alizarin crimson, because he used so much of it, it all cracked. And he had to go in with a conservator and figure out how to save that painting. So other than that, his paintings have lasted, he's got them from the 50s and 60s that are doing great. So as far as our lifetime, most of these materials that they're using today, most of them are going to work well. And I don't know how much we need to get too overwrought about it all.
Laura wants to know what it's called again, the stuff you're using to seal instead of gesso. Do you want to bring the can over and just
Sure.
show them what the can looks like?
Where's it at? Right here. Okay, so this, can you see it there? Is it in there?
Come down a little bit so we can see the top tag. There.
Okay, so there's Ecos Paints. I had to order this online and then it shipped it to me. It's called Passivating Primer. They use this in the Louvre Museum. For the last 30 years, they've been using it there, and they have not had any problems whatsoever. It's $100 a gallon, but you only have to do one coat, and you've sealed your board. So really, for the amount of effort and the fact that it seals and it's archival as far as we know, I think the Louvre probably does some research with the materials they use. I'm not positive on that, but I thought that would be a good thing to try out. I actually called the company to ask them questions about it, and that's how I found out about the success that they've had with it. I just started with this in the last couple of weeks. The boards, I just got some boards primed. This one is one of those boards that's primed with that passivating primer. And I like it. It's working out well. Although it is more absorbent than a lead ground. The reason why a lot of artists like the lead ground is that if you put down a wash, it's very fluid, and if you come back in and try to wipe something off, you can get down to the white very easily. But if I just take some walnut oil, even on this, if it's a little bit absorbent, a little bit of walnut oil, and I can wipe it off very easily too. It's not as fluid to work on as maybe a lead ground, but it sure is a lot easier to mess with it, to prime it in the first place. I don't have to wait 6 months or a year for it to dry. I can start painting on it the next day. It only takes a few hours for it to dry.
And you prime front, back, and all sides? You seal it completely?
Yes, I seal it completely, especially something like MDF. Now, if I had an indoor-outdoor board, like maybe a Baltic birch plywood, but see, I used to use Baltic birch plywood in the 90s, and then they changed manufacturers, and it started, they were getting wood out of China that wasn't made with the same resins. It started to warp and cup on me. It didn't do that in the past when it was coming out of Russia. So I stopped using the Baltic birch plywood. Even the 1/2 inch was warping and cupping, and that's not going to work with paintings. It has to stay flat. The MDF I've been using since the late 90s, and I've not had any trouble with it, except if I don't prime it right away and it gets wet. So something to consider when it comes to an acrylic gesso or primer on something like an MDF board is that if it gets dunked into water, the acrylic primer is actually still porous. It does not seal it watertight. So if you get it into water, like if it just gets a little moisture on it, you're not going to have a problem. But if it gets into a flood or something, you get water on it like that, it's not sealed watertight, and it is going to ruin your panel, and then your painting is lost. But you know what? there's really nothing in this life that is absolutely permanent. That's just the nature of mortality. Otherwise, this passivating primer, I think it's going to work out great. I'm excited about it. But then I don't know for sure. I guess I'll keep on experimenting and trying. I had a lot of really bright color, that light tan peach color right there in the center and off to the left and right side of that rose. But within that bright color, there really wasn't any substance. There wasn't any structure to it. So now I can take that, now that I have all of that in there, I can come in and break that up with just a brush stroke here and there with some nice little shifts of color and color temperature and value, putting in like a bright stroke of red, of some cadmium red or quinacridone red in there, or even just little shifts of grayed down peach color in a spot here and there to give it some of those shifts, some changes, something to give it interest in there. Just being bright isn't interesting. It has to be that really wonderful, strong, high contrast that's there, coupled with some movement within that center area of that rose, and even off onto the sides of the right and left sides of that rose. I want to have plenty of movement and the feeling that there's more than just one petal in there that goes from the left to right side. I want to have plenty of petals in there, bigger petals and smaller petals. And it's not about necessarily a certain specific shape to the petals so that they seem like they're the right shape for a rose petal, but more of just an overall interesting shape that works like a small shape that works next to a large shape, and they both work together and give the semblance of a rose. But more than that, they're giving something very fun to look at, something that's engaging, something that invites the viewer to come in and look closer and move around in there and enjoy it all, enjoy the color and the contrast. So if you really look at what I'm doing here, it's not so much about the color as it is about the values that are there. So if you squint, you'll notice that the roses, for the most part, are either very bright to contrast with those really rich darks that I'm trying to get in the center and around the painting. but it's also middle values, because I have the background that's mostly light values, and then I have some really dark leaves underneath the roses, and I have those middle values, very more on the darker side of middle, but the middle values that help to give it a richness. Middle value colors are the colors that have the most saturation of hue within them. So I love to have middle value colors. I also love to push the contrast between bright and dark, between light and dark in my painting. So I'm trying to move those colors throughout the painting. A leaf that's dark at one spot, and then another dark area somewhere else, and between the lights and darks, they're moving the viewer through the painting in a way that moves them all around in the painting, not just in a localized area, but all throughout it. And I want those to feel engaging, that they have some kind of intent behind them with that movement, that it's not just a random chaotic movement, but that there's some reason for moving the viewer in the way that I'm moving them through the painting. So for me, like with that really dark leaf, there's a couple of them right there on the left side, the thin one and then the bigger one right there on that left side. I like that they're moving the viewer from the lower left corner up towards the roses. But then as we come up a little bit higher from that thin rose on the left side, I also have another even thinner streak that is like a rose stem that's right there, and it also moves the viewer in. So it's not just one strong movement up through those roses and then out of the painting. I have other limbs pointing in other directions to help move the viewer around the painting, not just in one direction, but in multiple directions, so that it creates a circular movement through the painting, but not in a way that's hopefully not completely obvious, but in a way that feels natural to the way roses grow, and also gently leads the viewer, or in an energetic way, leads the viewer around the painting. So I'm accomplishing that with that high contrast of those leaves, the brightness, the bright petals and the flowers, but also in the background with the dark. They're not as contrasting as the roses themselves, but I still have the light and dark value shifts in the background, as well as warm and cool color temperature shifts in the background, and warm and cool color temperature shifts within the leaves, within the petals of the flowers. And I'm trying to get those all arranged in a way that is harmonious, that really has that movement and energy and harmony, balance that's desirable in a painting, so that the viewer will want to continue moving around in there and enjoying the whole environment, the whole kaleidoscope of rose colors and the rose environment. From this point on to the end of the video, it's little things that bug me. So I'm going through and tidying things up, while at the same time, as I do that, I see bigger things that need to be brought in. So sometimes it's like on a flower petal, there might be just a small area of value where it seems like too abrupt of a transition. So I might come in and soften out that transition. Or in this case, I put that line in there, and eventually I decide I don't like that line, so I have to smooth that out and take it out. So then it's just a matter of mixing up the color correctly so that I can create that natural transition again between the lighter value and the darker value, or even within an area that I get the right color so that I'm getting the overall tone correct. So right here, it seemed like a really big area where we have that bright spot, and then there's a little darker value piece of a flower petal behind it, to the right of it. So breaking that up, coming in with some shadow underneath that, I can turn that into a couple of petals to a degree rather than just the one. And that's what's fun about the way that I paint, as far as finding objects within spaces of color. It's imaginative painting, coming in and seeing maybe a jumble of colors and then thinking, well, what is that jumble of colors? Is it just a jumble of colors, or can I turn it into something like a few leaves or a few petals, flower petals? And then voila, that area is no longer just a jumble of colors, but it feels to the viewer as if there are objects there, and they make sense together. But there's such a mix of colors and color temperatures and values that it becomes a fun little area. It's abstract as well as concrete in the realism of the objects, or at least in feeling natural and understandable or legitimate to the viewer. This leaf, I wanted to make sure it had a good direction. I'm trying to avoid any parallel lines, the railroad track type lines in my painting. And that can be with a leaf like that and a flower petal, or it could be two leaves that are going in the same direction, sort of like the long thin leaf and the wider dark leaf down at the lower left side. Those are kind of railroad tracks right now. Even though they're different sizes, they still create that feeling of being a railroad track. A set of railroad tracks, I should say. So I need to disrupt that somehow. So here I'm trying to make sure that bigger leaf there at the top doesn't feel isolated, as if it's a lone wolf right there. Because then that also, being a lone wolf can also demand attention more than I might want it to. So putting in even that small little dark leaf with it helps to then make that feel like it's a branch that's coming up through there with leaves on it. And then it's not just the one bigger leaf that's there. It's a combination of leaves, bigger and smaller, and they feel like a unit. So then the viewer is then concentrating on the unit, and because it's a unit, it takes less attention, and then the attention can go back to the roses rather than where the dark contrast of it might require more attention than the flower itself, to a degree, or at least compete for attention with the flower. I don't really want it to compete. I want it to feel like it's a supporting character, a supporting actor or actress in there. So then down here underneath the flowers, there's just a lot of dark brush strokes, but they really don't say anything right now. We don't have to necessarily spell everything out so that there's nothing for the viewer to figure out on their own, but we also don't want to have ambiguity to the extent that it's confusing for the viewer, or it doesn't fit, it doesn't match the rest of the painting. And that's what I felt with those areas down there. Right now, they just don't match the rest of the painting. They feel incomplete. with that leaf right there, I'm wanting to get some highlight on there. I want it to feel like there's planes. One plane is facing the sky and getting more light on it. Another plane starts to tilt away from the sky, it gets less light. And then a third plane that's even more, it's in the shadow. Doesn't have to be strong changes in value or color, but I want to have some kind of change in there to show the different planes of that leaf. More than just the drawing, the outside edges of that leaf, which kind of denote that there's some kind of a plane change in it. I want some more color or value shift in there, for one, because it gives variety to that leaf, and then that makes it more interesting to look at. And for another, it just helps then to explain those plane changes a bit, and the source of light, where the light is coming from. And then that helps then to help bring that leaf forward, because it's also getting light, and if it was coming forward, it should get light. If there's that much light on some of those flower petals, then there should be some light on some of those leaves as well. And that'll help to then bring that forward from that all that jumble in the background, in the center there, underneath those flowers, and give a lot more meaning and depth to that whole space. But that color that I had on that top plane of that leaf was too much like the background, and it felt like there was a hole in the leaf rather than a plane change or a plane on that leaf catching the light more. It just felt like there was a hole in it and we were seeing into the background. So I want to have that brighter area there, but I don't want to have a hole in my leaf. So bringing in some little colors, little thin lines can make a big difference in the energy and interest throughout the painting. So I bring in little areas of color, but notice that they're not as bright as what my main flower is there with all those bright petals on it. They're a little bit more subdued, but they're still colorful. They have some nice saturated color in there, and it helps then to bring the colors of the flower around and through the painting. And those are just little tidbits, little elements that help to lead the viewer around in the painting and give more interest to those spaces. And those kinds of shapes, I don't have to put a lot of definition in there. I give little tiny bits of change here and there, little color shifts or value changes to make it more interesting, but not necessarily so that it spells everything out there. That gives a little bit of that pause for the viewer's mind to fill in some of the blanks, to fill in some of the missing details. But there's enough detail around it to let the viewer's mind do that without having to work at it or struggle too much. I don't want to wear the viewer out. If the viewer gets worn out, they might just decide to leave the painting rather than trying to figure it out. It needs to be a peaceful, enjoyable process. So here, if I have a larger shape, like that bright gray-green shape underneath that flower, then I want to break that up. Not dramatically necessarily, but maybe with some other color that I can put in there that can break up that shape. A color that's close to the value and the color that's already there. So I wasn't really satisfied with the dark line that's now underneath that brighter line that I just put in. The darker line was supposed to basically be the stem for that rose, but I didn't like where it was placed. So I'm changing that and I'm making it a bit brighter coming up underneath that flower. Gives more of the feeling that that's closer to the viewer a little bit and catching some of that light, just so I can bring in more color in that area. With all those darks in there, I didn't want to have also the stem that dark. So this is just giving me an opportunity to drop in another splash of color. With this stem, because it's prominent right there coming up underneath that flower and really visible to the viewer, I want to finish it out more and really come in with some of the halftone and the way that the light and shadow come together and blend in with one another. So those transitions, I want to get some of those transitions in there between the light and the shadow and really form it out without getting carried away. I don't want it to become hard-edged and lifeless, but I want to give it some definite form right there because it is so visible. And then if I give that kind of form to that one, I don't necessarily have to do it to the other one, and I can let the other one just have the petals be the what demands all of the attention, and the stem underneath it a little bit more ambiguous and just areas of color and the color shifts that move the viewer at least up into that flower. So here's a way that I can help to also build out some of the interest in that leaf, bringing in some reds and little edges onto that leaf. I love doing that part of painting where I come in with some of those little edges on leaves and flowers and stems. That's a lot of fun because I can really play with some color in there and making some interesting shapes, interesting forms, interesting drawing. That's all a lot of fun. Much of the final details here are just a joy to work with. Because I can play with it and manipulate these things and move them around and see what kind of movement I can get and how what line can I place in here that will suddenly move the viewer in a way that they didn't expect, or that gives a lot more force and vitality to the painting. So if I end up putting in a thick stem like that, and sometimes I'll finish it off and think, it's just too straight of a line. It has no life to it. It's just straight and awkward. So then I want to usually come in and put just even a little bit of curve to it in a spot can increase the energy of it, make it feel more alive. So little touches like that, that's just bringing in light and shadow. I love cast shadows like that because then it really forms out some of that three-dimensional quality that is so much fun, especially in a flower painting. So sometimes I'll lay down some, like a spot of brilliant red in a shadow like that, and then come on top with a darker value or darker color but I do it in a way that I don't get rid of all the red necessarily. It kind of filters through there a little bit, or it's just on the very outside edges of that particular item that I'm working on. But it gives that little spark of warmth that adds a lot of vitality to the area. So there we go again, changing the direction a little bit just to break up the line. I don't want to have arrows where it goes from one side of the painting straight on out the other side of the painting. I like to disrupt that some so that the viewer doesn't have a trajectory like that. I don't want them to feel like they're being forced in one direction and then boom, they're out of the painting, and where do I come back in? That sort of little break, even though it's subtle, it can be a significant shift in momentum to move the viewer through the painting rather than out of the painting. Or it might not do anything like that. It might just be fun for me to play with. So that is it is my painting, and I hope that I enjoy the whole process. Since this is a rose hedge, at least in my mind, that's what I've created. We have this rose hedge out in our front lawn, and I love that. I look at it every time I go between my house and my studio. I'm studying that. And I love all of the interaction between the little bits of leaves and the thin little stems that can come off of them, the way that they can catch the light, even down in the depths of all those leaves and branches, there'll be some little spot of light that's sparked in there, and warmth down in the recesses of all those leaves. And so I bring some of that into, at least I try to bring some of that into my paintings as well. So in this case, where I'm envisioning that this is now more, rather than just a rose that's growing on a straight stem in a pot, in a planter, it's more of a rose hedge, and it's one of those stems that grows sideways and several flowers grow off of it, and then there are flowers right behind it and to the side of it and all around it. So I can get all kinds of color and little stems and branches and leaves that are catching the light and twisting and turning. That's how we can get a lot of variety in there that we wouldn't otherwise think to put in there. That's the wonderful thing about painting nature, is that we have so much opportunity. So that's just a subtle thing right there, but that's that shift between the more yellow, warmer areas of that leaf, and then just bringing in some cool greens on top of that so that I have a shift between warm and cool, warm and cool. I love those warm and cool color transitions. Color temperature transitions, I should say. And the same thing there. I didn't want that to suddenly feel like a hole in the leaf. It was getting way too close to looking like the background color. So just softening out some of that, blending it a bit, helps to take away that feeling of a hole in the leaf. Another big part of all of this is coming in on the edges and just disrupting an edge. Grabbing a hold, because this is wet into wet, the painting is still completely wet as I'm working on it. I can come in and grab a bit of an edge of something like a stem and just grab the paint right there and pull it out into the background. And that helps disrupt that edge. It helps to then integrate the stem with the background. Because out in nature, when we're looking at something, it's like we've talked about so often, there will be little disruptions because there are, let's take the stem for instance. A stem on a rose bush is not perfectly cylindrical. It's going to have little tiny shifts and changes, little areas that where you have a flat, even a small minuscule flat spot on that round stem. And that flat spot is going to catch the light differently than other parts of that stem. It might catch a highlight because it catches the light even more, or it might become a shadow that's on there. And that shadow might be the same value as some leaf that's right behind it, whereas the rest of the stem is brighter in value. So that's where coming in and disrupting an edge somewhere is helping us to mimic nature, because that's what happens in nature. We have all these little tiny shifts in one part of a stem. Even if it's the same value all the way up the stem, one part of that stem might suddenly cross a leaf or another stem behind it that is the same value, and then those two kind of blend together. So that's where an edge will suddenly be disrupted. And that's why edges are so crucial to making our paintings feel real. That's where a lot of the life in a painting comes from, are the edges, the way that we work with our edges. If edges are all too sharp or all too soft, then they don't have that essence of reality. So here, this is just a matter of connecting this without, see, right now that's coming right out of the top of that rose, and it kind of leads the viewer right on out as well, and it's going right towards that corner. Usually we don't want to have a line going right into the corner of our painting, either any of the corners. And this one, it doesn't do it directly necessarily. A little bit of it does, but I have plenty of other little stems coming off of that, little branches that aren't going right out of the corner of that painting. But still, I want to create some kind of disruption to that line so that it doesn't feel like a straight line leading right out of the top of that flower. So that'll just take a little bit of manipulating, bringing in some different colors and color temperature shifts, value shifts, any little thing, disrupting an edge like we just talked about. All of those can help to then break up that line a little bit. So what I do in those situations is I push my brush through the paint, especially where I have plenty of paint to push it through, a little pile of paint on my palette, and I take it just on the edge of my brush, and then I can use that either a bright color or a dark color, and I can just run a real thin line through a space in my painting to break it up, to break up that space, and to give the feeling of some kind of little branch or stem. That's why I love to have a brush like these synthetic mongoose. I think they're actually not probably synthetic. I think they're badger hair now, because mongoose isn't available, but that it's mimicking what we used to have as the mongoose brushes. Anyway, that nice little, it's the Rosemary Masters series brush. They can get a really nice thin line, a real sharp edge on the end of that brush, and that end is what I use to make those thin lines. That's why my brushes, for me, it's very important that I can get a nice crisp, sharp edge on my brushes. I don't always need that crisp edge. Sometimes I want to have a brush that has some splaying to it, because that can help when I'm really creating some chaotic foliage in my paintings. That can really help with that chaotic foliage. But in a case like that where I want a nice thin line, I want my brush to maintain that kind of line. And it has to be very quick. I can't go in and push the brush hard and fiddle with it. I have to know where I want that line to go and then lay it in one smooth, very slight pressure movement so that the paint just kind of drags softly off the edge of that brush and it leaves that line behind. So now I've decided I really don't like that brush stroke under there. Often I do. I like an area like that where you can really see all the bristles of the stroke of that brush. But in this case, it's distracting from the main center of interest, which is that rose, that bright rose right there. So I'm going to come in and try to break that up some and turn it into something. I'll use little parts of it as shadow back behind, but I really want to disrupt that so it's not distracted, because especially since that petal right there, the dark orange petal at the bottom of that flower is on a tangent with the edge of that brush stroke, and that doesn't work at all. I don't want tangents like that. Because really what that's doing is it's bringing attention to that brush stroke more than to the petal on that flower. So here that leaf just needed to be broken up a bit. It needed something different there. Getting some movement down there hopefully without overwhelming it. I don't want it to be too strong because I don't want the viewer moving that direction necessarily. But I did want to break up that area down there a little bit. And it helps to break up the feeling of how big and strongly dark that other leaf is as well. It gives a little bit more there for that leaf to give that leaf some company. Which is what I'm attempting to do with that little leaf as well, right there next to it. Although I don't really like that now that I've put it in there. So I attempt to hide it a little bit, but decide, no, it's just not working. And rather than try to cover that up, we can come in and cover up things like that, but that was such a big, thick area of dark paint that it would be much simpler to just wipe it out rather than trying to cover that whole thing over. And then it's a matter of matching the background again. Coming in with bright color, dark color, not like dark like the leaf, but the light and dark, the way that we have that variety and fluctuation within the background colors. That's just a little too strong right there, right? Especially right at the top of that. I really want to kind of soften out that. Oh, that I did not expect. I didn't realize there was all that dark paint that got on there. I definitely don't want that at the top. I really want the top edge of that to fade off into the background a little bit to really soften out the edge of that. And not for any particular reason. It's not, it could be a hard edge up there. There's not, that's really just a feeling that I felt like it needed to be a softer edge up there. But I don't have any strong reason for that in my mind. It's more in an attempt to pull the viewer back down to the other rows more and allow that darker red rose to be secondary, to be a support to the other rows. Even though it is going to have a lot of it has the brilliant red tones in it, those do demand a lot of attention. I still want it to feel, that's why I have some of the overlap on it, to help push it back in the distance a bit. And that was an example of how just bringing in, even right here, bringing in just little bits of the color from the flowers into other parts of the painting. So right here, what I'm doing with my finger is I'm blocking out a certain, if I think something might not be a good idea to have in there, if there's something in the painting and I'm wondering if I should take it out, I will place my finger in a way that it blocks that from my view. And then if it looks better without it, because what that does is it just creates kind of an empty space in my painting with my finger there. So then I can see if it looks better with an empty space there or with that object that I was covering over. And then I can decide whether I want to take out the object or not. My professor in college, he used to always, the impressionist, he would put his hand up there all the time. He was constantly bringing his hand up and covering up an area and seeing if it was working or not. And I've adopted a little bit of that. Although I do tend to use my mirror and the stepping back quite a bit more than I use that, more than I'll use like my hand placing it up there to block something out. I'll just go back, I'll look in my mirror to see if things are working, see how things stand out. That's much more of a tool for me than the other. So I didn't feel like I really had to define that more than I did. It was intended just to overlap that other flower right there so that it pushes that flower into the distance just a little bit, even by degrees. It helps take away some of the force of that color shape so that it adds some color over in that area but doesn't say, hey, look at me. There I am again, just breaking up an edge here and there. And often I'll break up an edge like that by using some of the other colors that are in the background. Not necessarily the color that's immediately next to that edge, but a color, as in that case, some of the peach color that's grayed down quite a bit, coming in with some of that color. So then that breaks up the overall greenness of that shape and that space, and just brings in a little bit more varied color for that spot. So I felt like that they have that little leaf and that petal of the flower that are both in the same, they're a tangent with each other. They both come to the same height. And I thought, well, I definitely need to break that up. But I didn't want it to be too dark up there on the tip of that, because then as that comes out into that light background, that really, the darker, if it's too dark, it's going to be another focal point, just because of the contrast there. So here's coming in and breaking up some of the edge of that brush stroke. And that's just by pushing down into it. It's still wet. If it was dry, then I would just dry brush over it with some color. So I thought about adding a highlight onto that flower petal, but then it just gave it kind of an awkward shape to it. So I'm not real thrilled with the shape that created right now. It's kind of pulling it out towards the viewer now with that little highlighted edge, and I would rather it push back into the background rather than pulling forward like it is. And there we go. We'll just make that a little bit smaller so it's not quite so obnoxious there. and I definitely get rid of the tangent that I had with that brush stroke and that flower petal. It's probably a good idea to use one brush for dark colors, one brush for light colors, but I have a tendency to use the same brush for both when I get to some of these final details. And I just make sure that I get, if I had used it for a darker color at one point, I just make sure that I wipe the brush pretty well with my paper towel and then get plenty of paint on the end of it so that that dark color isn't going to affect the light color that I'm using. Now, if I take that dark brush and try to mix it into, let's say I take the dark brush and I try to mix some more yellow into a bright pile of color. Well, that's not going to work. But when I'm just going down and pushing my brush into a bright pile of color and getting some on the end of it, that's when it works. I can't use it if I'm mixing, if I'm blending some colors together. But if I'm just grabbing a pile of paint and then with one stroke placing it onto the painting, then that works. That's how I get away with using the same brush for both light and dark colors. I like that. Opening that up a little bit more. It was all very closed off. I don't want to create spotlights in there. That that doesn't work out too well. But I can come in with some bright color like that and then break up just by moving I can break that up again so it's not a spotlight just by moving some of the edges around, pulling some of the background into an edge and pulling some of the edge of that bright out into the background. And that way I can start to integrate the two areas. But I still like to have some of that bright in there to break up some of that space. And early on, I liked having those darks in there. I often like to come in right from the beginning with some nice dark shadow shapes that I can build on top of. But at the moment, those are just feeling kind of odd. It's one long line of shadow right now, and it just doesn't feel right to me. So I'm now thinking about how I can break up that shadow shape and still utilize some of it, but not have it be, it's right now it's an actual dark shape that goes right through that space, and there's nothing to say why it's there. It's as if it's some kind of object that's completely alien to the rest of the plant. So I need to break that up and turn that into something, some parts that match the rest of the stems or the leaves or something else within that area, within that space. And rather than coming in and enlarging that dark space and trying to pull it up through places in there, I decided to just eliminate a lot of the darkness of it. So it's a lot of fun too when I have a little bright stem to just come in and follow the bottom of a bright stem, putting a little shadow on there. Doesn't have to be a real dark shadow, but even a spot of red along the line of that is a lot of fun. So here I need to change up that little leaf because it's going in the wrong direction. I broke that up because those two lines were parallel to one another. And I'm still thinking about that little petal right there, and I'm very happy that I broke up this dark shape there. It's working a lot better now. I feel much better about that area. And I'm thinking about pulling some color up in some of these other spaces like that too. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about right here at the end, the little details, the little things that might really help finalize this painting, because I am right here at the end of it, so close. But there are some very definite things that need to be done, and right now it's just a matter of intuition, feeling out what it needs, and then stepping back and looking at it for a while, inviting Christy in to come look and tell me what I need to do. All of that is what is the end process that I have. And oftentimes I have to call Christy back in over and over again, say, okay, is it good now? Well, how about now? and she has such a great eye for spotting some of those little things that need to be done. So right here in this area with that stem, I talked about it a little bit earlier, how I wanted to create more form there, but it's feeling kind of big. And I want to feel like there's more air in there, more light, more diffusion of light in there so that it's not quite so heavy. I want the roses to feel light, as if they're just delicately balancing on those stems, and that they feel buoyant, not heavy, and as if they're being weighed down. And so if it gets too dark up underneath there, I love contrast. I like that strong contrast, but sometimes it'll feel too dark and heavy. So like in that spot, I want to help pull all of that out. So I'm right here, right in those areas. I take my brush and just kind of push some of that paint up into it with a dry brush, and I can help to move those lines and take away some of that heaviness from it. A little change in the mics because I asked Christy to come in and look at the painting, and I thought you would enjoy hearing the way that we discuss my paintings sometimes, and this is one of those rare occasions where we don't necessarily agree.
I love the background and I love the leaves and sticks. I wish the flowers were a little bit more developed.
Ah, I see.
They just look like the wild roses that are flat and kind of ugly.
Oh, okay.
I mean, like, you know, the beautiful full many petaled roses.
You want the full many petaled roses.
You know, just that, yeah.
Well, I'll have to think about that because
You like it.
Uh-huh.
Then leave it. It does have a loose wildness to it that
Appeals to me.
I mean, I actually love it. I wouldn't call it roses though.
What would you call it then?
I don't know. I'll have to see what I would call it.
So she wouldn't call them roses, even though we have this huge hedge out here full of these roses that are pretty similar to those. But that's exactly why art is so wonderful, because it is subjective. There's a lot of variety of opinion and interest out there. And even between Christy and I, we have differences of opinion. And she may be right. Maybe everybody else who looks at this will think, they don't look like roses. To me, they feel like roses and they look like roses, but maybe not to anybody else. And I suppose that's probably all right, as long as I'm not worried about selling it in case nobody else thinks they look like roses. I don't know. But in the end, we just have to kind of follow our instincts. It's good I listen closely to what Christy has to say because I trust her opinion, and she's usually right. But in this case, I liked what I had here, and I didn't want to lose it. I didn't want to come in with a bunch of other petals. I've done plenty of roses that were the old English-style, full-out garden roses. But I like wild. I love just the feeling of those petals moving and twisting and bending and all wrapping around together in some of that space in there, and that's a lot of fun for me. So I decided to keep it the way that it was. I would love to hear what some of your experiences are with critiques from friends or loved ones, especially from those that you really trust and appreciate, like I do with Christy. So this stem, I'm working back and forth, pulling some of the paint into the background, pulling some of the background, the paint on the stem into the background, and some of the background into the stem, just working. That is the way that I draw with paint. I'm just trying to get that stem exactly the way that I want it to be, so that it feels good to me. I want it so that the viewer can see exactly the form of that stem, and that it has a lot of interesting color shifts and value changes in it, so that when the viewer can see it, it's worth seeing. So that's one of those areas that I spend a little bit more time on than I do in some of the other spots in the painting. sometimes it's just taking a couple of little bristles on the edge, the corner of a brush, just a couple of bristles, and letting those bristles pull paint. It just kind of grabs the paint on like the light side of that and drags a little bit of that, just little tiny bits of paint up through the dark part of it. And that gives that optical blending that I'm searching for in there. And then here I talked about getting rid of those railroad tracks, and I end up pulling that leaf on that rose straight on down. So sometimes I forget why I made a change early on in a painting, or earlier on in a painting that actually wasn't that long ago. But part of the reason why I did that was so that I could change some of the space behind it. But even still, I ended up going from railroad track to railroad track again. But hopefully it's not that noticeable, because I do like at the end of that how the very tip end of that little leaf turns out. It's a fun spot in that painting. And I kind of go back and forth a few times with just that space behind that dark little leaf. Because I'm just not settled on the value and the luminosity of it back there. Seems like it's coming forward just a little bit too much. I feel like I need to tone that down some. And then, of course, I've got this petal right here that I feel is a little bit distractive. What I really need to do is just break up that dark space back there. It's just too dark overall. And help define some of the little things that are going on in there with the little leaves that are coming off of that stem and off of the rose. Give it a little bit more of that buoyancy that we were talking about earlier. So you notice part of that right there, that was just those few little bristles grabbing some of that paint that I just placed down and pulling it lightly, not so that it gets too bright up in there, because the closer it gets into the underside of that rose, the less light is going to be filtering through. The farther out we come from it, the more a hole in that area there is going to let light through. But as we get closer in, where the dark and the light come together, it's going to get less and less light filtering in that space. So I don't want to get too much of that bright going right up into there, but enough so that it breaks up that area. It makes it a little more light-filled and interesting and buoyant. And sometimes I go back and forth. I just can't get settled on getting a space quite right, the way that I feel good about it. Occasionally, a painting will just flow right through and it's done. And once in a while, I've got a spot like that that just takes as much time as anything else that I've worked on. So some of those little final 10%ers can really take a lot of time occasionally. There we go. Rather than having that darker part of that stem, I'm coming in with a little bit of color. It's still a value darker than what the bright part of that is, but it is a definite change in the color of it. All right, one more little area. I still feel like that isn't quite right back there. It's just feels like it's pulling forward too much. And I don't want it to in that spot with that particular flower petal area. And after a few days of looking at this, I might end up finding a few more things that need to be done. I'm just experimenting, bringing in some color here and there and playing with some of it. Oh, that might be a bit too much, a little too dark. So I'll just tone that down a little bit. My paper towel. I don't like that dark line though right there between the shadow and the brighter spot on that petal. So I'm going to try to tone down that line a little bit right there. So even if Christy doesn't quite feel like these are roses, or even if nobody else does, the painting really is more about color and value and movement than it is about any particular object. So not getting caught up in worrying about what kind of object these are can help a lot to not lose something that might be magical. And for me, the way that those bright petals and the shadow area on that main center of interest rose are working together, to me that's magical. I love that way that that's working. So I don't want to lose that, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like the kind of roses that somebody might be expecting. Yeah, some of those spots that I put back there were just too dark for it to be that far off. So I need to tone all of that down. I don't want it to be too dark of a value back there because I really want that to push back into the distance, especially since I have that branch, that stem that's coming up off of that main rose and pointing right towards it. If I have too much that's real strong, either in color or contrast, then it's going to push the viewer right into that spot, and that's not where I want the viewer to look. I want that area to be interesting, but I don't want it to be a center of interest, a focal point. It's a very, very minor focal point. Just a tiny little bit of change. I wanted to get that so that it's really thin right there, and I feel like it was just too bulky and not as interesting as it could be. So I'm getting that just a touch, working back into it to thin that little leaf out. To open up that space a little bit more. And that is it. That's all she wrote. I had a lot of fun with this painting, and I hope you did too. Happy painting, and have a great time making your own rose masterpiece.